Welcome everybody to our aesthetic water cooler session this evening. I'm the host, Larry Green. I'm a dermatologist in the Washington, D.C. area, and I'm an associate clinical professor of dermatology at George Washington University School of Medicine. So as you know from previous episodes, my passion is advocacy in dermatology and getting involved and trying to make a difference in the world in terms of helping our patients because they don't know the medicine, they don't have the background to be able to help themselves and make life better for them. So that's the whole reason for this water cooler series. Water cooler series is to encourage other dermatologists to get involved and to be effective advocates for themselves and their patients, and really to grow as dermatologists and to grow their business lives as dermatologists. So with that, I want to thank Equa Marketing, the leaders in digital marketing for dermatologists and aesthetic dermatologists and doctors in general, for sponsoring this water cooler. So if you want, people can ask questions that we can easily do. You have to raise your hand, and we can do that when and if anyone has a question. But for now, I'm going to start and just talk about our topic for tonight, which is how to be an effective advocate in clinical trials, or how to start a clinical trial center. A lot of what I do is running clinical trials and having clinical trials in my private practice. And I am someone in private practice, although I have university affiliation. It's a volunteer affiliation, and I just go there to do surgery clinic with the residents and to proctor, be an attending in surgery clinic. So that has nothing to do with the clinical trials. The clinical trials I do are on my own. And that's something I enjoy doing and enjoy working on, because what I think it does is it gives my patients the option, if they want, of getting advanced therapies before anyone else has them. And it also gives me the opportunity, if I am doing well and enrolling a lot of people in the clinical trial, to publish results with a sponsor. And this is always done with the sponsor and with the sponsor's permission. And oftentimes to speak about these results in conferences. I really enjoy it. It gives me a break. I think a break from seeing patients every day. It's a break from doing what I usually do with insurance or even doing aesthetic dermatology. It's just another aspect, another facet of my private practice that diversifies it and makes me enjoy what I do more. So let's get started. How does one establish a clinical trials practice? What do you do? Well, first you have to be in a practice, obviously. And then if you don't own the practice, I'm in private practice, I'm by myself, so I own my practice. If you don't own the practice, you have to talk to people that own the practice and get buy-in from them. So that's the first thing to do. Now, once you have buy-in, I think it's very important to establish the right infrastructure for doing clinical trials. You can't just say I'm doing clinical trials without knowing what it takes to run a clinical trials center. And it does take a bit of a time commitment in establishing that structure. So what does that mean? Well, I think it means you have to have in place, first of all, you as a dermatologist need to prepare yourself to run clinical trials. There's something called good clinical practice. Then there are courses on how to do good clinical practice and the guidelines on how to do good clinical practice, and guidelines for research, what we're supposed to do with research subjects. It starts with informed consent, and there's a whole process on what we have to learn and courses we need to take on our own to be certified in GCP, what's called GCP, Good Clinical Practice Guidelines. And the NIH has a course, and that's free, and there are other courses that have a nominal fee. But that's something that you do every few years to certify yourself in as a dermatologist. And then at the same time, you have to have dedicated study team people who will have to do the same thing on their end. So GCP guidelines, there's GCP guidelines courses for study team members as well. I have study coordinators. I have 3 at this time, but I mean, if you're starting, you start with 1. But I have 3 full-time employees that currently work only on studies. And that's something that you build. Like I said, I started with 1. So you dedicate someone for the clinical trials. And if you have one clinical trial, what I find, and I'll say this over and over, that you usually need to have one full-time person per clinical trial you do in your practice. So they are very time-consuming, not necessarily for me, the physician, but for the clinical trial staff. It's very time-consuming, and there's a lot of paperwork, and we'll go through all that. So establishing the right infrastructure means getting the right space for clinical trials, taking the correct courses, and also you need to have the right equipment to start a clinical trials practice. You need to have someone, for example, let's talk about equipment for a second. You need to have someone who knows how to draw blood, because almost every clinical trial requires blood draws at certain times in dermatology, even in dermatology. We have an EKG machine, electrocardiogram machine. Almost most clinical trials, even topical clinical trials for acne, oftentimes require baseline ECGs or EKGs for that. And they require baseline labs as well, and blood drawing. Now, we do not analyze the blood drawing, it's shipped off, but every day to wherever the study team sponsors want it. But that's something you need to be able to do. You have to have a place to store medications, and the medication storage, if it's refrigerated, has to have a monitor on it, for example. It's monitored to make sure it stays within a certain temperature range. If it's stored at room temperature, you have to have locked closets that are locked, or places where are locked and no one can access the study medication. And it also has to be kept at a certain temperature, around room temperature. And if it gets too hot, say in the summer, that closet gets too hot, the air conditioning isn't on in your facility, that could be a big problem, because the study medication would have to be thrown away. You have to have, so I mentioned refrigeration, possibly EKG machines, some to draw blood. You oftentimes need to have as well a centrifuge to spin that blood down. So usually, when we have one to spin it down, we often do urine pregnancy tests as well. So having a bathroom close by for the study participants is also very important. These are little details that are important to establish that infrastructure for your clinical trial center. And people respond when they come, before they let you do a clinical trial, we'll visit your site, and they want to see that your site is ready for clinical trials. Oftentimes a crash cart is needed, crash cart equipment. That's not usually for dermatology studies, but it's always a plus. That's more equipment to have. You have to have, usually when clinical trials are done, the charts, if they're on paper, have to be stored also in a place that can be locked, so no one can access them after hours. And then oftentimes you have to keep clinical trial materials for the study participants for like 8 to 10 years. And we do that off-site. We use a storage facility, but they have to be able to be accessed if the FDA does an audit of your site as well. So you have to keep things for many, many years, and the sponsor will make that clear that has to be accessible and kept for many years. So those are things that we do that in terms of establishing the right infrastructure. Okay, that's equipment. What else? We talked about training that's needed by the study team and yourself as a dermatologist. We talked about equipment. And then the next thing I want to do is I want to talk about is the infrastructure and the knowledge to work with a pharmaceutical company or the CROs, and we'll talk about CROs in a few minutes. But you need the study team to know how to interact with those people. The first thing you want to do is you usually get what's called a clinical trial synopsis of a study, and you'll go through it, see if your study is a good fit. For example, I'm a dermatologist. I see acne in my private practice. I see psoriasis, and I see a lot of aesthetic patients. I don't see much atopic dermatitis or lupus or other conditions like that. So if I'm offered a clinical trial in lupus or atopic dermatitis, I won't take it, because I don't want to participate in a clinical trial that I don't think I can recruit study participants for. So it's a waste of my time and my effort, as well as for the study sponsor, to have me commit to getting patients to participate in the study. That's going to be very difficult for me to do. So you have to know that your site where you're doing your clinical trials is a good fit for that particular study. There's a lot of studies I turn down. In fact, I turn down more studies than I accept because I want to make sure I'm a good fit. And that's part of establishing the right infrastructure for your study. So that's one thing. And then once you do, you say the study will work for us, I think we can fill it. You have you see you have a clinical trial agreement with the sponsor. Then you start working on, and if they select you, they'll do a site visit and look at your site. Every time we start a new trial, before we start, we have to do a site evaluation visit. And the sponsor, the pharmaceutical company or the representatives will come evaluate our site to make sure we have the right equipment, the right infrastructure, enough study monitors, study coordinators to make sure that they're up to date, to make sure they look at my resume, they look at my study coordinator's resume to make sure we have the right education, we have experience. All that comes through when it comes to doing studies. Very important. And then after that, one of my clinical trial coordinators is a specialist in creating budgets and working directly with the pharmaceutical company, the CROs. So we need to create a budget for that study. They'll give you a budget. You have to accept it. But it's nice to have someone to work on that budget to see if it's acceptable to you. And that budget is usually very detailed. How much is paid for each blood draw? How much is paid for each EKG that's done? How much is paid for each patient visit with the study coordinator? How much is paid for the investigator, myself, to look at the patient? How much is paid for the subject? That's usually subject evaluations. How much do they pay for this? How much do they pay us for shipping blood samples to them or setting up chest x-rays? Some studies require, especially the biologic studies, require chest x-rays, biologics for psoriasis. So all that has to be put in a budget. And then the other thing your study usually has to have is standard operating procedures. And it's SOPs, or standard operating procedures, are a set of guidelines that your study site is supposed to go by. Now, I don't know how many SOPs each site needs to have, but you need to have some baseline SOPs. So standard operating procedure: what happens when we take informed consent for a patient, for example? What's the protocol we follow? And there's usually a standard protocol people are going to follow for doing informed consent. And you have to make sure that your site and study coordinators follow those guidelines to a T. What's our standard operating procedure if we have a temperature excursion? Say the temperature in the refrigerator gets too high for a study medicine that has to be refrigerated. We need to have an SOP on what to do for that. So we have SOPs, and those are a set of guidelines that you create that your study site is supposed to go by. So this is all part of establishing the infrastructure to do a clinical trial. It sounds daunting, but it's not really. I mean, it's something that will flow and come to you, and you can do step by step. Not all of it has to be done at once, but you do have to have the basics. And if you're starting for first time in studies, you can see the equipment you need specifically for that study before you have a site evaluation visit. So you, at least for that first time you do clinical trials, you have the right equipment. But again, you want to have dedicated people, and you want to have the education, and you want to go over the budget. You want to know who does what, and then a few SOPs to start with. So that's the first step, establishing the right infrastructure. Now, what do I think is the next step? I think it's very important to create time to do clinical trials. If I were seeing 40 or 50 people a day, I don't think I would have time to do clinical trials in my office. I wouldn't have time to spend seeing a clinical trial patient. Now, I don't spend that much time with my clinical trials patients. Usually a study participant is there for an hour, hour and a half with my study team. By the time they do their patient evaluations and the subject evaluations, and they draw blood and do the EKG and answer all the questions and do this evaluation, that evaluation, I come in, it usually takes between 5 and 15 minutes. But that 5 or 15 minutes, if you're seeing 40 or 50 people a day, can be a significant amount of time and your burden. So you need to carve out time to see your study participants. Now that can be done however you want, but you have to carve out time. I don't see that many people a day, and so I find it easy to carve out time when I'm seeing much less people per day to do that. But I wouldn't be able to do that if I were seeing more people. Now, if you're in a practice with multiple dermatologists, then if you're interested in clinical trials, I think your time the amount of patients you see should be brought down to make time for study participants. It's very important, because if you're investing in clinical trials, you want to be able to spend time to see the patient. Again, it's not that much time, but when you have a busy day, it certainly adds up. So I mentioned training. That's something we have to do. The basic GCP training is you have to repeat it every 2 years. and every one of your study coordinators has to do that as well. But there's more training you have to do. Every study usually has its own training. For example, if I'm doing an acne study, people with acne, every single acne study usually requires me to do training on how to do lesion counts, how to count the investigator global assessment of acne, and other evaluations for acne. So, and also it will require me to go through the protocol. So I'll have to spend time online going through the protocol, doing investigator global assessment, and also lesion counts, how to do that. And you have to take a test and you have to show that you know how to do that stuff. Because if you don't know how to do it well, or I shouldn't say well, if you don't know how to do it that fits within the guidelines of the study, it doesn't matter if you're well or not. You have to do it so that everyone all the investigators in that study do it pretty much uniformly the same way. That's very important. Now, one way of avoiding doing that on your own is if you go to the investigator meeting. A lot of these investigator meetings take place towards the end of the week on Friday and Saturday. Sometimes they're on Mondays, but usually Friday and Saturdays. And the study team, it's very important that at least one of your study coordinators goes. And it's nice if you can go yourself. All that stuff will be done, lesion count training and going over the protocol ad nauseum at the investigator meeting. So that's a way to circumvent that, doing that stuff on your own. But that's taking a weekend or a day off your practice and something you have to do on your own and take the time to do. Now, they'll pay for you to go out there. They don't pay you for your time there. They'll pay for your airfare and your hotel, but you're not paid to be there because if you're doing the clinical trial, this is something you need to do, bottom line. So that's extra time in doing that. It doesn't matter how learned you are in doing psoriasis assessments or acne counts, you have to go. You have to do it again. And you have to get certified, and they want your certificates when you take the tests. So one example of years ago, we did the original studies for Kybella, my site. We had to learn how to do evaluations of submental fat. Now, no one from the top-notch aesthetic dermatologist to anyone knew how to do that. There was a new submental fat rating scale that was created, and we all had to be trained in that. So again, we were all uniform in how we assess the patient. It's very important if you're going to get accurate assessments to be able to do that. So it's important to create time outside of patient hours. That's very important. And so it's not just establishing the right infrastructure, you want to create time outside patient hours. So those are the first two things. And we'll review all this later. But let me talk about a little bit more of how studies get done and I want to spend some time on this and who you work with on studies and what it works. So obviously we're working with a pharmaceutical company. With the clinical trials I do, I'm doing phase 2 and 3 clinical trials. So it's already with a medication that has gone through preclinical testing. These are not NIH grants on the basic science level. I'm doing pharmacology, new materials, new items that are available that pharmaceutical companies want to come to fruition. They're spending a lot of money to try and get their product to the FDA and get approved. And as an aside, I've done clinical trials that have products that don't get FDA approved. Not everything gets FDA approved. So I did a trial, it was a few years ago, on a product that was supposed to help get rid of belly fat. If you had a little tummy roll, it helped to get rid of belly fat. It was an series of injections, and it didn't meet its primary endpoint. So the company invested a lot of money into this product. And I was one of the investigator sites. It was probably, I don't know how much millions of dollars it costs to run a phase 3 clinical trial. But we had 20, 25 subjects, and I'm sure all around the country there are hundreds and hundreds of subjects. And the product didn't get FDA approved. It didn't meet its primary endpoint. It didn't melt enough fat or get rid of enough fat. The idea was there. It seemed to work in phase 2, but when they went to phase 3, it just didn't pan out. So unfortunately, that product didn't work. And so that pharmaceutical company, spent millions and nothing came from it. So let me go back. So we want to work with pharmaceutical companies. So how do you get to know the pharmaceutical company, and how do you get to know them on the research end? Well, we as dermatologists usually deal with the marketing side of big pharma. We know the marketing people. They come to their office. The sales reps come to our office. Sometimes their district managers come to our office. These are all marketing people. When it comes to doing clinical trials, you really need to know the medical science people. Now, sometimes it's easy. They have MSLs, medical science liaisons, and certain companies, especially the bigger companies, have them. And these are companies more, whether they're aesthetic or not aesthetic, just the more basic science. So, psoriasis, they do psoriasis or acne medications. They feature those medications, but they have what's called MSLs or medical science liaisons. They're a great first step because if you're interested in doing clinical trials and you're trying to establish the right infrastructure and you're able to create the time outside of patient hours to do all the training and work that you need to do to get the trials going, then these are good people to start with because they have, although they're on the lower end, they're sort of like the sales reps for they're not sales reps. I guess that's a bad analogy, but they're sort of like the lead liaison that interact directly with physicians all around the country. But they know who in their company to connect us with if we want to do clinical trials. They'll know, or they may be able to do the first site evaluation visit. They may be able to check out your site and to see if it's ready to do a clinical trial and help you with what you need and what you need to get ready for their particular company. With that particular, not just with that particular company and the products that they have, and the potential products that they have, I should say. So that's something you can do on your own to get working with pharma. That's the first step. And if you're at a big meeting, we recently had the American Academy of Dermatology meeting here in Washington, D.C. That's a great place to set up meetings where the MSLs can set up meetings with their bosses and their bosses' bosses and their medical team people so that you can meet with them and get to know them. And you have a chance one-on-one to tell them about your interest in that particular product. And again, I suggest when you do a clinical trial, you only pick companies that have potential products that you can work with. It's your interest because you have a lot of that in your practice. For me, again, if it's atopic dermatitis, I'm not interested. I just don't have the clinical practice for that. It doesn't mean I don't like atopic dermatitis. People that I would love to have patients in my practice with atopic dermatitis and treat them and make them better. They just don't come to me for whatever reason. So that's not a good fit for me. Now, if you're a general dermatologist or then an atopic dermatitis is a great fit. That's fine. It just is not for me. For some people, doing a botulinum toxin study may be a great fit. If you do a lot of that, but some people don't do that. Wouldn't be a great fit. You wouldn't want that type of study, that type of study in your practice. Because again, you don't want them to invest in you because they're investing in you. They're counting on you. It's a lot of work on your end if you're not going to be able to achieve your goal. So working with pharma. That's the first thing. Getting to know the MSLs, getting to know the science people in those companies. Very important. And I think the MSLs are great on a day-to-day basis, but I really think asking them to meet with people at meetings is just as important, if not more important, because they don't really make all the decisions. They can put you on a list, but there are a lot of people who want to be on the list for clinical trials, and you need to somehow get your name recognized on that list. And knowing the higher up people, letting them introduce you to the higher up people, their bosses, are very important and help building, getting your resume built in the right direction to do clinical trials. So you have to be an advocate for yourself. Very important. And I mentioned this in terms of advocacy. I think it's just as important in clinical trials. It's networking. It's very important. You want to network with these pharmaceutical companies. Nothing may happen the first time, the first year, the second year, the third year, but they'll get to know you. You should meet with them every year, even if nothing happens. I can't tell you how many companies I've met with and nothing's come of it. I meet with these people and I learn them and I meet them. We talk about doing clinical trials and, oh yes, Dr. Green, we're going to include you, and it doesn't happen. It doesn't always work out, but that doesn't mean you should ever stop. It's a constant, part of doing clinical trials is constantly, I think, networking with pharmaceutical companies, not the marketing team, but the science team. I mean, I'm not saying not to talk with the marketing team. That's okay. But when it comes to doing clinical trials, it's the science team you want to get to know, and it's a science team you want to work with. So every time I can tell a story. For example, I was for a company. There's a product in psoriasis, a biologic, and I was invited by this company from phase 1 through phase 2 to events where they updated us, and there was phone calls in events at dermatology meetings where they would update all the potential investigators for phase 3, let's say phase 2 and phase 3 for their products. So we all were up to speed about how their product was doing. And I remember I wasn't selected for phase 2, but that's okay. I had networked with them for about a year or two and gone to their meetings, and they didn't, I didn't make the cut for phase 2. Phase 3 was coming, and I went to the meeting to hear all about the phase 2 results, and they presented their data, and I reiterated how impressed I was with the data, but how this medicine I thought would be great and a great fit for my practice, because I see a lot of people with psoriasis, and my experience in clinical trials with biologics, I've done so many, and they told me they were very interested. And when it came to the phase 3, which finally happened, I was put on the wait list. So they decided that my center, a clinical trial center, would be only used if something happened with one of the other clinical trials they selected. So I never did that study. I invested, working with them for 4 or 5 years and hearing about their product. And I was very excited about that product and very excited about bringing that potentially to my patients before it came out. Having that opportunity, it didn't happen. So there was a lot of invested time, didn't happen. And that happens quite often. I mean, working with these big pharmaceutical companies, networking doesn't always pay off. But when it does, it's great. But you don't count on it paying off every time. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't constantly always take the opportunity to meet with these people and reiterate the same thing you said over and over again the next time you meet with them, because you just don't know when it's going to be enough and when you'll be selected to be a clinical trials center for them. So I think that's an important thing, and that's part of working with big pharma. And that's something, if you're doing clinical trials, you need to spend time doing, especially at these dermatology meetings, the big dermatology meetings. And if one of their MSL bosses is in town and they want to meet with you, by all means, make the time to meet with them for lunch, dinner, or even during your basic clinical hours. Very important. Okay, so then there are things called CROs, and I mentioned this earlier. What is a CRO? A CRO is a clinical research organization. And most clinical trials are run through CROs. Big pharma does not want to be, it's better for them. I shouldn't say they don't want to be, I'm sure they want to be, but it's better for them from a perspective of how they look to the FDA about being a step back from the clinical trial that they're paying for. So a CRO, or clinical research organization, is an organization for clinical research. And the sponsor will hire them to run the study, basically. So if I'm a big pharmaceutical company and I want to run a phase 3 or phase 2 trial, and all these trials are registered through the FDA. These are big trials, hundreds of thousands of people involved around the country, and many, many investigators around the country and around the world, probably. So I'm hired by a big pharma to completely run the study. I'm a CRO, I'll prepare the study budget. So I'll tell the pharmaceutical company how much it'll cost. I will find the investigators. I will monitor the investigators. I will do everything that has to do with the study. I'll hire the IRB, which is called the Institutional Review Board. Every study has to have an IRB that approves the protocol. I'll write the protocol. I'll do everything. And all the pharmaceutical company has to do is pay me a check. So I'm the CRO. I will take a cut. I don't know what their cut is, but of course they take a cut, a percent of what the pharmaceutical company pays. Everything else goes to the running and of the clinical trial, paying for advertising for the clinical trial, paying for the investigators, paying for the clinical trial sites. Study participants always get paid as well. So every study participant, has to get paid, and that's all worked into budgets that the CRO will work out with me, the investigator. So when I work on a budget, and I mentioned that about establishing the right infrastructure, the first thing we talked about, we will work with the CRO on that budget. So getting your resume into CROs is very, very important. I think just as important, if not more important, than getting to know the big pharma companies. Because the big pharma companies can choose you. That's okay. But a lot of times you don't know all the big pharma companies. There are companies that I've worked with that I never heard of. And because they're upstart companies and I'm not aware of them. But they'll hire the CRO. The CRO will find sites they've worked with in the past or sites they know of. And they'll say, hey, Dr. Green is a good fit. He does a lot of acne clinical trials. You have a new product for acne, and Dr. Green's done 5 or whatever, how many clinical trials with us in the last 2 or 3 years, or, and we know that Dr. Green's a good fit for acne. we'll hire him. So we're the CRO. We know who can do good trials for you, big pharma. A big pharma may say to the CRO, well, I know Dr. Green's really good. I don't know if you know who Dr. Green is. And the CRO may or may not know me. I may be a CRO I've never worked with. But it goes both ways. A lot of times the CRO picks, in fact, I think more often than not, the CRO picks the sites. I've been excluded from some trials, for example, where I know the pharmaceutical company and I want to work with them in that clinical trial, but the CRO doesn't know me and they have their own group of investigators they want to select for the clinical trial. So working with the CROs is very important. How do you get to know CROs? Well, they're at the AAD meeting. Often they're in the technical exhibits. There are some CROs to work with and send them your resume. And that's how I found a few. And then when you do clinical trials, if you get on one through the big pharma route and a CRO is running it, then you'll get to know the CRO. The CRO is the one that often, sometimes it's big pharma, but usually it's a CRO that hires what's called a study monitor. The study monitors come to your site every few weeks to go over everything you've done with all your study participants. So you have to make time, your study team has to make time to talk with the study monitors. They spend their day with the study monitors, giving all the information they need to go over, make sure every rule that the FDA wants followed and every rule of the study is being followed to make sure that this is a good, legit study that's done according to recognized informed consent and according to protocol, so the results are certainly scientifically sound and valid. So we want to do that. That's what we're trying to do studies for, but we're monitored to do that. Study monitors come, and the CROs hire the study monitors. Sometimes pharma does, but usually it's a CRO. So all sorts of different types of monitors that come, depending. And then as the investigator, by the way, we have to sit down and talk with a study monitor at the end of whenever they're here a few weeks and spend it's usually 15 minutes to a half hour talking with them about how well or not well your site is doing in terms of recruiting or filling out the forms correctly, making sure that everything is done, so again, so that the study results are valid and scientifically sound. So we talked about establishing the right infrastructure, and that involves making time. It involves having study team, clinical study coordinator, one at least, having SOPs, standard operating procedures, knowing how to create budgets for the study, working to having the right equipment for the study, making sure you have enough equipment for that particular study, knowing what you can do studies in best. Pick what you do best. Those are the studies you want to do. We talked about how important it is to create time outside of patient hours to see study participants and to do the paperwork in the background material to make sure you know that study protocol up and down, and to make sure you're an accurate assessor compared to what the study wants, so that everyone is on the same page when they're assessing the study participants, so that we're all doing the exact same acne counts, or psoriasis PASI the same way, or measuring submental fullness and Kybella studies, or botulinum toxin studies measuring frowns. So, how big the frown, how much a frown is relaxed. There are ways of doing all that, and you have to make sure the investigator is set and all that. That's a lot of extra work. And you have to take time to go to an investigator meeting if that's possible. And you have to take time out of your practice to do patient evaluations. So I talked about how do we do that? How do we get involved in clinical trials? We talked about working with pharma, how important it is to network with the medical side of pharma companies, because those are the clinical trials I do in the phase 2 and phase 3. They're clinical, they're FDA registered trials on FDA.gov, and you need to know the people and they need to know you. And then just as importantly, if not more importantly, I just talked about CROs, clinical research organizations. They run the clinical trials for big pharma. There are many of them. And then actually there's been a lot of them have conglomerated lately and becoming from lots of small ones to one bigger one. They buy out each other a little. That's happened. But you want to work with them. And there's some CROs we like working with and some CROs we don't. And unfortunately, sometimes those CROs won't choose us for studies because we've had bad luck working with them. It's my study team has not worked well with their monitors or vice versa. And there's got to be a good match because you spend a lot of time with the CRO people when they come to your office. So that brings me more to monitors again. So and I've started talking about study monitors. They're usually employees of the CRO, but they can also be employees of big pharma. So study monitors spend a lot of time with the study team, and they need to be on the same page. They need to work well together, because I have almost a study monitor there once every week, once every 2 or 3 weeks, and they're spending a few days in my office. And they're, like I said, their job is to go over every patient, study participant chart. And a lot of this is done electronically. They do it electronically now, but make sure every T is crossed, every I is dotted, and everything is being done according to protocol. And so the patients are taken care of correctly. Everything is being done. Everything is being monitored and evaluated. So that, again, the scientific information is valid. So there could be personality conflicts. Sometimes that's happened with my study team and the CRO people. I mean, you never know, but you want to work. You have to work well with everybody, because they're going to be in your office. Now, usually we find a place for the monitor to sit that's not near where the study team is working, because the study team doesn't, they have their own work to do, and the monitor has their own work to do, and the one doesn't want to bother the other. Although the study team is constantly going back and forth to the room where the monitor is, they're in a separate room, in a separate place than my study team, because they each need to be able to do their work without the other one bothering them. But it still takes most of the day. If my study team has a monitor for one of the trials in the office, they're working with that monitor a lot, back and forth, getting information they need, showing that the I has been crossed, that the I has been dotted, the T has been crossed, and everything is being done appropriately. So they spend a lot of time. And then at the end of the day, like I said, me, the physician, has to work with the monitor, see how things are going, do like a little summary, and go from there. By the way, when a site evaluation visit or site qualification visit comes, the investigator also has to spend time with the person who comes from the CRO or the pharmaceutical company. And so that's something I neglected to say. You have a site evaluation visit. That's when they look at your site, make sure it fits and it's got all the right stuff there, the right equipment, and the investigator is willing to give the time commitment, and the study coordinators are there and they have enough time, not overworked, to do the study. After that, if you do well in the site evaluation visit, then they have what's called a site qualification visit. I'm sorry, site qualification visit is the first thing. Oh boy, I'm using my words. Site evaluation visit is to make sure you're all set. Now I'm really confusing myself. Site qualification visit is where they go and make sure you qualify for that study. Site evaluation visit is to make sure you fit. The site qualification visit is to make sure you're good for that study, and then if you may be picked from there. There's 2 visits oftentimes that they do, the SEV and the SQV, they're called. Sorry about the confusing myself. It's a site evaluation visit. This is to see if you have a good site. A site qualification visit is to see if that study in particular is a good fit for your site. And the monitors come, and then they'll do evaluations, like I said, every few weeks in your site. So what else does it take to run a clinical trial center, to be an advocate for clinical trials? You need to be an advocate. I mean, I think that's important. You need, studies last 3 months, 4 months, 5 months, then they're over. And I have 3 full-time study coordinators. I need to keep them busy. I have to find other clinical trials. It's constant networking at every dermatology event I can go to that with big pharma or the CROs present. When CROs have receptions, I want to be there. I want to show my face to make sure they know me, make sure they want to continue to send me clinical trials and they know I'm a good fit for the clinical trials they want. If it's a clinical trial, it's a good fit for my site. Very important. So it's constant networking and to find new studies. And again, taking only studies that fit your practice. And I think that's the last point. I mentioned it before. I think it's the last point I want to talk about, because if you're not a good fit, they won't use you again. And that pharmaceutical company will never want to use you. They'll never pick your site, or the CRO will never use you when they get a study. And if they get a study that may be actually really good fit for you, they won't use you, because you said you would be a good fit for a study that you weren't a good fit for. So networking is constant. It's constant. Every chance I get, I want to meet with MSLs and there's the people who are their bosses and CRO people and meetings, because you need to know. And you also need to know what's going on out there. as much as you can about what's up on the horizon for clinical trials. So all those things need to be done. All those things, I think, are important when it comes to running clinical trials. So I'm going to summarize over the next few minutes, and then I'll open up to questions, or if anyone wants, or summarize in general, so we have a good recording here for those people who access this in the future. So how to be an effective advocate for running clinical trial practice, how to run a clinical trial practice. 1, establish the right infrastructure. You must have the equipment. You must have the manpower to run a clinical trial. And usually it's one person, full-time employee, per clinical trial. If I have 3 full-time employees, I don't want to have more than 3 clinical trials going on at once. It's that much work for a person to do. You have to have the right equipment. You have to have SOPs, standard operating procedures, done in your practice. You have to make sure you and your study team have done GCP training every few years, good clinical practice training. I think it's usually every 2 years it has to be done. You need to have that all documented. You have to, of course, as the investigator, you have to make sure all your medical licenses are up to date. I'll take that for granted that's being done, and everyone has done that. You need to know how to negotiate budgets for the clinical trials. And that's important because you don't have to accept the budget that's presented for you. You have to create time outside of your regular patient hours. If you're someone who sees a lot of patients every day and you're going from patient to patient, clinical trials are not for you. Bottom line. You have to make sure you have time outside your business hours because you have to do things in the evening. A lot of times, I forgot to mention, there's safety events, especially in the biologic trials. There's safety events, and every single safety event that's reported in that clinical trial, you have to go over and sign off on. So every night, there's several safety events I may have to go online, and I'm given a notice to read and sign off on. And also download so that we have a copy of every safety event. You have to go to investigator meetings, or if not that, you have to do a lot of online stuff on your own. It's encouraged to go to investigator meetings because you'll learn the protocol in and out, so you're very familiar with it. You will have to be on the same page as doing investigator evaluations as everyone else who's doing the clinical trial. I don't care if you're the biggest expert in the world on acne, you must be on the same page and learn how to do evaluations. The same person who's been out of residency for 1 year does clinical trials and is doing acne, counts for the same first time, because everyone must be on the same page. And then you have to make sure you're a good fit. Of course, your patients are a good fit for that clinical trial. So we talked about also the CROs and big pharma, getting to know them, working with them, constantly networking with them, making sure that you keep an eye out for them about clinical trials that are upcoming for their products, and making sure they're keeping an eye out for you. And with these are not the marketing people. This is the medical science people. It starts with pharma with their MSLs and the scientific team, the research team, the clinical research team that big pharma company has. And then we talked about the CROs. Okay, the CROs, the clinical research organizations, are the hired guns of pharma to run their trial. It's usually done that way. Big pharma, again, it looks much better if they're hands off on running their clinical trial and they hire someone and just pay them than if they're actively involved in the clinical trial, because there's less hint of bias if you hire someone to do something for you than if you do it yourself. And because the big pharma has a bias, of course, in making sure their product succeeds. So if they're hiring someone to do everything, they're more hands off, the product succeeds, then people will say, well, it can't have been influenced by the pharma because they hired someone to run it for them. And this is someone who runs many clinical trials. So they don't have the same investment in that product as the big pharma does, who spend millions and millions of dollars getting that product to phase 2 or 3 or wherever it's getting to before you do that clinical trial. So we talked about study monitors. They're in your office all the time. The CROs or big pharma will have study monitors to monitor your study, make sure it's being done appropriately, and making sure everything is done according on the up and up. And they spend a lot of time in there. And like I said, I have a study monitor in my office almost every week for a day or two. So, and that's fine. They need to be there to make sure the study is being run appropriately. And my study team and myself are doing things according to protocol. according to good scientific sound principle, and the evaluations are being done the right way. I shouldn't say the right way, but the right way, because it's the way where all investigators are doing it the same way, so we have good uniform scientific results. And last thing is, don't stop. Studies just last a certain amount of time. I've started a study today. I've got to be looking to get more studies because it takes months and months and sometimes years to have a study in your site. And so I'm constantly looking for the next studies. If I'm concentrating too much on this study, I'm giving all my time in this study, but don't get me wrong. That study I have, when I'm there, that study gets the utmost amount of time. But when there's a meeting and I have a chance to think about other studies, I'm going to network and I'm going to go and learn about other studies. Now, I'd get them known that if it's a study I think that fits my session, or my clinical practice, I should say, that it'll be a good fit for me. So that's pretty much it. I'll open up if anyone has any questions. But that's pretty much how I think to get a clinical trial site going. And it never ends. It's constant to keep everyone busy and keep things interesting. But the trade-off is, what you gain from this, I think, is having a lot of fun and being at the cutting edge of your field. At the edge, you know what's up and coming. You know about that product so much. If you're a clinical studies site, you know about that product in and out well long before it becomes to market. I think that's the advantage, and that's what makes it part of the reason it's so fun. So I'll close here and leave it open to questions, and before we summarize and close out.
I have a question. How do you go about keeping your staff busy but not doubling up on studies where you're overworked? Do you have leeway on start dates?
That's good. So studies are usually, you'll have the site qualification visit, and then once you have that, you can usually start enrolling. Once everything's been signed off and all the paperwork's done and you're clear with the IRB, and I forgot to talk about IRBs, those are called institutional review boards. Those are something that the CRO will hire, the big pharma will hire. We use what's called a centralized IRB because it's one central for all the investigator sites that makes sure the protocol is being done and is being followed, and the protocol is written in a way that's safe for human participants. So all that has to be followed. So as far as your staff, you want to take on enough clinical trials so they're busy but not too busy. If you don't have enough clinical trials, like I said, you usually want one. I look at it as one clinical trial per staff member. So I have 3 clinical study coordinators full time. I have 3 clinical trials going on at once. But sometimes one ends before the next one starts, and I only have 2. Sometimes there's 4. But you try as best you can to not have more, because then you won't be able to enroll enough participants because your study staff is too busy with all the other studies to get the newer studies getting enrolled. But you don't want to be bored and not have any studies. That's why I think it's important, like I mentioned, to keep working on the new studies that could potentially come in the future while you still have the current studies, because you have to have something for the future. So a lot of times I'll be offered a study. For example, I'm doing an acne study, a topical acne study, and we just started, and then I'm offered another topical acne study. And I do well with acne studies, but I don't want to have 2 studies. One of the rules I always follow is I don't want to have 2 studies going on at the same time that are enrolling the same patient population, because I think they compete against each other, and that's what we don't want to have happen. So if that study came 6 months later, I'd be winding down in the first acne study and be fit perfect to the second topical acne study. But a lot of times it doesn't happen, and you have to pick and choose. I've already got my topical acne study. I signed the clinical trial agreement. I'm getting ready to go to the investigating meeting. I can't take on the second one. So I think that's how you do it. You have to pick and choose, and they choose you as well. But you don't want to have overlapping studies, I guess, going on at the same time and doing the same testing for the same clinical trial product, like acne or psoriasis topically, for example. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, it did.
All right. So anything else anyone can think of? Okay. So I'm going to thank everyone, and I hope people enjoy this archived session as well. and people are welcome to share feedback and even the archive, and to share their feedback when they hear the session archived. We want you to be engaged, and we want you to know about this water cooler series, and I hope it helps your private practice to get things going. And I want to thank Equa Marketing, who I think are leaders in digital marketing for dermatologists and physicians as well, for sponsoring this water cooler. And once again, I want to thank everyone for joining. And please invite other people to join the water cooler series as we do this more often. We do this usually on the first Monday of every month. This session was the second Monday of the month because last Monday I had my big annual meeting for all the dermatologists in the country. But in general, we do the first Monday of every month at 8 p.m. And I look forward to everyone participating and getting involved. And please tell your friends. So with that, I'll say thank you very much.